Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. This is, in my work, fairly hot off the press, so I'm a little bit unsure of it, and I'm a little bit tied to my script. So forgive me if I'm a little bit bound to the lectern. Hopefully, it will all make sense as we go along. And this is part of a larger project. Trying to use the resources of ancient philosophy and looking at normative questions around persuasion and the expertises in persuasion, dialectic and rhetoric in the ancient world, and connect those with questions of applied ethics today, particularly raised in the area of leadership around how humans should influence one another, and the norms that apply to persuasion in that context. So this is a kind of part of that to do with the use of emotions in that process. So as is well known, the first extended discussion of the emotions in Western philosophy comes in Aristotle's Rhetoric, in a context where what is at issue is the use of emotion arousal by an orator to influence their audience. It's surprising, therefore, that among the abundant philosophical literature on the emotions, especially in recent decades, there's so little dealing with the ways in which the arousal of emotions can be used by one person on another to persuade them of something. This paper focuses on this kind of process and on the propriety of its use. We might frame the issue that I'm looking at as arising from the recognition of the appeal of two claims that you might think were in conflict with one another, and those are the two claims at the top of the handout. So the first, which I've called propriety, so the claim is that persuasion should succeed by getting people convinced on grounds that contribute to justifying their inclination to favour whatever it is that the speaker is proposing. And the second claim, which I've called anti-austerity, is that it's not required that persuasion's methods be dispassionate, i.e. passionate methods. There are going to be some passionate methods that are okay. Now, neither of those claims is wholly uncontroversial, but both have, I take it, very strong intuitive appeal. To hold them both requires that it be true that emotional persuasion contribute in the right kind of way to swaying people in favour of the speaker's proposal, i.e. that the emotions contribute to the audience's justification for being inclined towards the speaker's case. And this has often been found difficult, even in an era when the view of the emotions as kind of irrational forces that sweep over the subject from outside has largely fallen from favour. Now, if these two claims cannot be held together, we'll be under pressure, of course, to drop one of them. And it's the second that looks the more likely to be dropped, to yield a view according to which persuasion ought properly not to proceed through the use of emotion arousal, leaving either no place or only a marginal place for the emotions in persuasion. And that's a bad result. Partly because it fails to accord with our intuitions about the permissible persuasive use of emotion, and partly because enforcing the resulting austere normative position tends to elevate further in public deliberation the contributions of, well, people like me, white middle-class men, and to marginalise the voices of those from already less privileged groups, women, ethnic minorities, working-class people, whose persuasive styles either are or are taken to be more excited and emotive, less dispassionate, and so on. That's kind of, so I'm kind of standing on the shoulders there of Iris Marion Young's work about inclusion and democracy there, where she traces that in more detail. So this paper takes up the challenge of showing what we would need to believe in order to hold these two claims together. I'm going to focus on the kind of persuasion that aims at getting others to believe something. As opposed to being wholly focused on persuading people to do something. So the two are kind of connected, but it's focusing on persuasion to believe that I've got in mind here, really. What this should involve, I claim, is contributing to the justification of the beliefs it's trying to produce in the audience. The relevant kind of justification here is epistemic justification, being justified in believing. In order for emotions to contribute to epistemic justification, they must, I hope to show, be capable themselves of being epistemically justified and of transmitting that epistemic justification to the beliefs to which they help give rise. This seems to require that emotions be, in significant respects, similar to beliefs, that they have representational contents, that they involve the subjects accepting those contents as true, that they be candidates for epistemic justification, such that their contents can properly feature as premises in inferences that justify the subject in believing the conclusion of the inference. That emotions have representational contents is here I'm just taking that as granted. My focus is on their involving acceptance and possessing epistemic justification and having their contents feature in justifying inferences. And as will become clear, I'm broadly following what I take to be Aristotle's kind of stage directions here. So, although ultimately I am wanting to commend as plausible the picture that I'm setting out, the immediate task, I think, is just to bring the picture into focus. What is it that we would need to believe in order to suppose that emotion arousal had a proper role in the kind of rational persuasion we want to endorse? And it will be helpful as a first step in answering that question to get a clear view of the phenomena we're talking about. What kind of persuasive use of emotion arousal do we have in mind? Okay, so on to section 2. So the persuasive use of emotion was common in the world that Aristotle was familiar with, and examples could be cited from that era. Likewise, one might note how a number of landmark pieces of persuasive speech throughout global history that we think of as clearly legitimate are obviously emotive in how they bring about their persuasive effect. So kind of everybody's favourite examples, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, Jawaharlal Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech, Emmeline Pankhurst's Freedom or Death speech, through all sorts of other places, Hebrew history, Jonah's speech to the Ninevites. There are lots of examples that one could cite. I'm going to use as my central example Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech at the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851, aimed at persuading those present and the wider world that they should support women's rights. I've actually put it on the handout as to do specifically with women's suffrage. I've since realised that's not really getting the history of that of her role quite right. It's more to do with legal rights in context, but it doesn't make much difference to the argument. But so her speech goes as follows. Actually, the provenance and the accuracy of the account of her speech is complicated, but none of that matters either for the argument. I'm just going to kind of take the usually accepted version as correct. I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have ploughed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too, if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have her pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold. The poor men seems to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Okay, isn't that fantastic? It's an amazing speech. Clearly it persuades in large measure through its use of emotion. Right? It invites admiration for the contribution of women to the common good, indignation at their unjust treatment, and a kind of ridicule at the absurdity of the opposition. Is this problematic? Right, should people be persuaded to be committed to women's rights in a more austere way that dispenses with admiration, indignation, and ridicule? Right, intuitively, no. Or at least, if there's any prospect for vindicating as legitimate the persuasive use of emotion, it's going to be in cases like this. Cases like this invite us to endorse both the claims that I started with at the beginning, anti-austerity and propriety. When Aristotle incorporates the persuasive use of emotion within his account of the kind of rhetorical skill worth valuing, it is perhaps cases like this that he has in mind, cases from his own day that are like this. Insofar as we share this kind of anti-austerity intuition, it will be because we too think that Sojourner Truth, like Lysias and Demosthenes before her, is not to be faulted for including the engagement of audience emotions within her persuasive arsenal. And this is reflected in Aristotle's more generalized analytic remarks and in the advice that he offers to orators on the persuasive use of emotion arousal in speeches. So this is the first Aristotle paragraph on the first page. There are three kinds of proofs provided through the speech. Some are in the character of the speaker, others in the listener being brought into a certain condition, right, that's going to be the one relevant obviously, and others in the argument itself through demonstrating something or being taken to demonstrate something. So Aristotle's here specifying the types of proof, his word is pistis, that form part of the repertoire of the expert orator. And in calling them types of proof, he's indicating that these are things that constitute proper grounds on which for listeners to be convinced of the orator's case. The arousal of their emotions, at least in the ways Aristotle will be recommending, is just such a thing. Accordingly, he recommends that orators arouse audience emotions in certain ways in pursuit of their persuasive goals. Now, of course, it's part of this rationale for the use of emotion that it works. Emotion arousal is often an effective means of securing persuasive goals. Not only does Aristotle recognize emotion's general usefulness, he recognizes that the precise contours of each emotion that the orator stirs up in their audience make a difference to the nature of its persuasive effects on the listeners. So the next Aristotle paragraph, proofs through the listeners. That is, whenever people are induced to an emotional state by the speech, for we don't give judgments in the same way when we're upset as when we're happy, or when sympathetic as when hostile. And then in the next book of the rhetoric, when he's further explaining this, since rhetoric, he says, is exercised for the sake of a judgment or a verdict, judging is what political deliberators do in the assembly, and a lawsuit is a judgment. Since rhetoric's exercised for the sake of a judgment, it's necessary to pay attention not only to making the argument demonstrative and credible, but also to present oneself as being a certain way and make the listener be a certain way. For it makes a huge difference as far as credibility or proof, it's the same word again, is concerned, especially in political deliberations, but also in lawsuits. Both for the speaker to appear to have certain qualities and for the listeners to take him to be disposed in a certain way towards them, and also, or additionally, if they themselves, the listeners, are in a certain condition. For the speaker to appear to have certain qualities is more useful for political deliberations, for the listener to be put into a certain condition is more useful for trials. And here's the explanation, the same things do not seem to be so to people that are sympathetic as to people that are hostile, nor to people that are angry as to people that are calm. Rather, they seem either entirely different or different in magnitude. Thus, to the person that is sympathetic to the defendant, it seems that they have committed no crime or a trivial one, whereas to the hostile listener, it is the opposite. To the person that is eager and hopeful, if the future prospect is something pleasant, it seems that it will happen and will be good, whereas to the listener that lacks these emotions or is feeling gloomy, it's the opposite. So the basic thought here is that feelings incline listeners in particular directions. Hostility towards someone inclines listeners towards judging them guilty. Sympathy inclines listeners away from such a verdict. It's this way round and not vice versa. Right, and similarly for the other emotions, Aristotle is saying. Aristotle directs the orator's attention to these, if you like, rather obvious features of how emotion affects judgment. It's the orator's business to develop a systematic understanding of what distinctive kinds of effects particular types of emotions have, or emotions with particular objects and content have. And he presents this as part of the understanding that will underpin their skillful deployment of emotional proofs. This observation about the way the particular contours of a given emotion serve to produce specific persuasive effects is important, in that it highlights that the persuasive role of emotion goes beyond simply making listeners generally more attentive to the speech. What one might call a kind of coffee and cigarettes view of the role of emotion in persuasion. So the point is, emotions aren't just perking people up generally to make them more attentive, nor are they getting people to be generally more prone to be decisive or something like that. They're inclining audiences in particular directions depending on the specific features and objects and so on of the emotion used. And that position is reflected also in the specific advice Aristotle offers about the use of various types of emotion when he treats them one by one in Rhetoric 2 to 11. Now he reminds the reader at the end of those accounts that these instructions on arousing and dissolving the various passions count as instructions on how to give proofs. Sorry if I'm rather labouring this point, but he calls them proofs. In other words, so he's giving the detailed advice and he's saying that's a way of giving proofs. In other words, he's committed to both anti-austerity and to what I've called propriety. He thinks they're not in conflict with one another. And when we consider Aristotle's position alongside examples such as the Sojourner Truth speech, I take it we'd like to say so as well. Okay, so that sort of, if that's right, that seems to motivate the project of trying to understand how the emotions work and what we could say to vindicate a legitimate role for them in persuasion. So how do they work? So let's try and go further than the general observations so far and see that the way emotion arousal achieves its persuasive effects seems to be by contributing to or undermining the inferences that listeners appropriately make in arriving at their judgments or decisions. And the role looks cognitive. Certainly as Aristotle understands it, it looks cognitive. And this is most easily seen in the instructions Aristotle offers to orators on how to use emotion persuasively. So Aristotle's definition of the passions in Rhetoric 2 and his general instructions about how to use an understanding of the passions in rhetoric are as follows. So this is somewhere on the handout. Yeah, page 2. The passions are those on account of which people change and differ with respect to their judgments, and which are accompanied by pain and pleasure, for example, anger, pity, fear, and as many others are of this kind, plus their opposites. With each we must distinguish three things. I mean, for example, 1, what state people are in. The 1, of course, is not in Aristotle's text. That's my 1. What state people are in when they're angry. 2, at whom they typically get angry. And 3, on what grounds. If we had 1 or 2 of these, but not all of them, it would be impossible to arouse anger, and likewise with the others. So, just as in our earlier discussion, and what he's referring to here is the previous book in which he set out how to construct explicitly presented arguments, just as in our earlier discussion we set out the premises systematically, we will do so similarly in connection with these two, observing the division just mentioned, i.e. the 1, 2, 3 that I mentioned. The passions, as well as involving pleasure and distress, are things that account for changes in judgment, and perhaps are themselves changes in judgment, although various interpretations are possible of what Aristotle means there. They're aroused by deploying an understanding of what kind of, say, distress and or desire is involved in each passion, what kinds of objects elicit that passion, and what grounds for the passion need to be apprehended by the listener if that passion is to be produced in them. The most natural interpretation is that the orator is to present the person in question, or their audience, not their audience. The most natural interpretation is that the orator is to present the person in question, perhaps their opponent, as a suitable object of, say, anger, as having features or having done things that are grounds for feeling angry, and in such a way that it is distress, not pleasure, that is aroused at these things, and a desire for revenge. The process of doing so is to mirror the process of constructing explicitly presented arguments, i.e. a process of methodically selecting premises based on the orator's systematic knowledge of what premises support what conclusions. Indeed, one might plausibly even read the final sentence of that passage as indicating that the orator's method of emotion arousal will literally involve premises for the arousal of emotions, and that what we are to be offered in the ensuing chapters on the individual emotion types constitutes the construction of a kind of systematic bank of knowledge regarding which premises will support the arousal of which emotions. The premises arouse the emotion, so the premises arouse the emotion, and the emotion in turn gets the audience to draw a particular judgment or verdict. So the emotion is a kind of interim conclusion which then functions as a premise in a further inference by which the eventual verdict or judgment is drawn, like the verdict in the court case, something like that. Emotion arousal serves a persuasive function because of the role that emotions play in inferences, according to Aristotle. That is, the role that emotions play in arguments presented by the speaker. This role consists in their contribution of premises by which the conclusion is supported. The kind of way in which Aristotle's view might apply to the Sojourner Truth case could be spelled out as follows, and I've put this in a table on the handout. So she advances an argument, which of course can be followed and might well be followed in an emotionless way by the audience, but it can also work emotionally, i.e. the drawing of the conclusion can be derived not just, if you like, from the emotionless apprehension of the premises, but by the emotional apprehension of certain key premises. So, you know, I mean, it's always rather kind of wooden when one spells out the steps, but you know, step 1, premise 1, women have muscle and plough and reap, husk, chop, mow, carry and eat on a par with men. 2, perhaps based on that, women contribute impressively to the common good. 3, it's unjust for such admirable contributors to be treated in such a substantially inferior way, not even getting their pint to a man's quart. And then 4, opposition to women's rights is based on a fear that women will take more than their little pint can hold on the part of men who are all in confusion. Okay, and if it's unjust and absurd to oppose women's rights, we shouldn't oppose them. It is unjust and absurd to oppose women's rights, so that's kind of just restating together what was in 3 and 4. Therefore, we should not oppose women's rights. The thought is we've got a set of steps where the premises lend support, justificatory support to the conclusion. Okay, and so the suggestion here is that with premises 2, 3 and 4, you could believe those dispassionately, but one way of apprehending those is to feel admiration for women, to feel indignation at the injustice, and to feel ridicule towards the men opposing women's rights. That's the thought. Those steps could be, if you like, held, or the mental state that could be involved could be an emotion. Admiration, indignation, or ridicule. Right, and that might go alongside also, if you like, clocking through the inference in an explicitly represented way. But the thought is that the emotion could be doing some work here, right, and which we can represent in the form of this inference. Now, of course, it's an empirical matter whether this is indeed what goes on within the psychological mechanisms of an audience on any particular occasion, and whether in general this tends to be the mechanism by which seemingly legitimate emotional persuasive methods, such as those to which I'm calling attention, achieve their effects. Okay, so we ultimately need to bat this matter off to the boffins to go and kind of find out how it is in the world. We're not going to be able to establish this from the philosophical armchair. Nevertheless, we can see that it's a perfectly intelligible way in which emotional persuasion could work, and it seems to be how Aristotle saw emotional proofs as working in his rhetoric. It seems to offer an intelligible explanation of cases such as that of sojourner truth. And so, in what follows, I undertake to explore the implications of this understanding of how emotional persuasion can work, or could work. In particular, what must be true of the emotions and the justification of emotions if this view is correct. So, in the next section, I highlight some conditions for the legitimate use of emotions to support inferences. Do emotions have the right kinds of features to play the role assigned to them according to this view? The kind of role in question seems simply to mirror the uncontroversial role of beliefs in persuasion. So clearly one kind of legitimate persuasion involves presenting someone with some reasons to believe something, getting them to form justified beliefs, and then using those justified beliefs, maybe plus other knowledge or justified beliefs that they have, to get them to accept some further conclusion on the basis that it's entailed or recommended by those things that they've come to believe. All right, so that's a kind of familiar process of rational persuasion involving beliefs, or what we might call belief arousal, all right, to mirror emotion arousal. It's clearly okay. A variant on it might be where persuasion involves, in relation to some of the steps, literally showing something, such that perception supplies one or more of the premises involved in the inference. Now, in both cases, the adoption of the conclusion inherits the epistemic merits of the way in which the premises are apprehended. Can emotional arousal play the same uncontroversially legitimate role as is played in those cases by directing perceptual attention, showing, and by giving reasons to believe something? Or is there something about the nature of emotions and how they differ from beliefs or perceptual states that rules this out? I propose that in order for emotion arousal to contribute to inference-based persuasion in this kind of way, at least the following conditions must be met. And these are on the handout on top of page 3. So the first condition is that the inference must be performed such that the conclusions are believed because of the truth or likelihood of the premises. So insofar as the believing of the conclusion rests on the inference, it rests on the inference through having performed the inference and because of the truth or likelihood of the premises. Second condition, the premises must contribute justification to the conclusion, and in the non-perceptual case, third condition, they must be asserted. So I'll just briefly explain each of those. When the first is fairly straightforward, to the extent that the inference is to contribute to the justification that the subject has for believing its conclusion, they must, to that extent, believe the conclusion on the basis of the truth or likelihood of the premises. In order for this to be the case, they've got to actually perform the inference and believe the conclusion on the basis of having done so. The second condition is that insofar as the subject's justification for believing the conclusion is derived from the inference, it must be derived from the epistemic good standing of the premises. So take the case that I mentioned earlier from the Hebrew Bible of the prophet Jonah's persuasion of the people of Nineveh to change their ways. So he famously said, 40 days, it was a very short talk, 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. That's it. It was very effective. They all repented and changed their ways in sackcloth and ashes. Here's obviously there's a master stroke of the talk to be able to set this out in 3 steps. Here's Jonah's persuasive argument. If there's a terrible destruction coming, then we must do all we can to avoid it. 2, there is a terrible destruction coming, therefore we must do all we can to avoid it. Okay. Don't let no one deny that there's devastating insight in tonight's talk. There's Jonah's persuasive argument. Okay, now the thought is, step 1, right, can be taken for granted. Everybody knows step 1. It's kind of obvious, known to Jonah's audience in some very robust sense. Their justification for believing the conclusion is going to depend most significantly on how justified they are in adopting the second premise. Okay, they may believe the second premise, but the weaker their justification for holding it, the weaker their justification for adopting the conclusion on the basis of the inference. Alternatively, of course, another way, so that's kind of tracing it through the Ninevites' beliefs. Persuasion of that kind might proceed by showing someone that a key premise is true, enabling them literally to perceive the content of the premise and establish perceptually for themselves that it's true. So perhaps Jonah might, in a variant of the narrative, have shown the people of Nineveh the divinely appointed armies massing over the brow of nearby hills to destroy them. Look, there they are. There is a terrible destruction coming. Look over there. But either way, the epistemic justification for believing the conclusion, insofar as they believe it on the basis of this inference, is contributed by the premises. And this may either be through the subjects being justified in affirming the premises, or through their perception of the premises being a source of justification in the kind of way that perceptual experience in favourable conditions is. And on that latter suggestion, the idea is not that perceptions are candidates for justification, but it's that they're evidentially valuable and can confer justification on beliefs based on them. If subjects are to be justified in believing the conclusion of an inference, the justification must be conferred in one way or another by the premises. Okay, and the third condition simply highlights that one can't be justified in believing the conclusion of an inference whose premises one merely entertains in thought without asserting them. In relation to this condition, we set aside the possibility that the premises might be perceived in an evidentially valuable way. That possibility apart, it looks as though the subject can only be justified in believing the conclusion if they actually assert the premises. So in the remaining sections, I'm going to consider how those premises apply to emotional persuasion and what light they shed on how we would need to understand the emotions for them to play the kind of legitimate role in persuasion that we've been tracing out. Okay, I'm actually going to skip over section 5 in relation to the first condition and go on to section 6. So we recall that if a successful case of persuasion is legitimate, this will be because the audience comes to be justified in believing the speaker's proposed conclusion. So that's the claim propriety that we started with. On the model of emotional persuasion set out in section 3, the emotions aroused contribute premises to an inference that the speaker intends the audience to perform, and thereby come to believe their proposed conclusion. The relevant kind of justification that we've got in mind for believing the conclusion is epistemic, hence the kinds of justification that the premises are going to need to confer is epistemic justification. So they must either be sources of epistemic justification or themselves possess epistemic justification. The idea that emotions can themselves be justified epistemically is unproblematic on a number of views of emotions. If emotions can be had for reasons, for example, because of evidence that their object is dangerous, and extinguished by reasons, for example, by evidence that their object is not dangerous after all, and if they can be assessed for how well justified they are in the light of the reasons available, then they would seem to be capable of possessing precisely the kind of epistemic justification that in legitimate emotional persuasion gets conferred onto the adoption of the conclusion. Now, this can be readily accommodated on lots of views of the emotions, not just judgment-based views such as Solomon's or Nussbaum's, but also on those views such as Goldie's view of the emotions as sui generis states that accommodate the recognition of emotions as reasons responsive and reasons accessible. Conversely, it seems equally clear that on so-called thought theories of emotions, insofar as emotions may be based on unasserted thoughts or partially constituted by such thoughts, it's very difficult to make sense of how one could be justified in believing the conclusion of an inference in which one or more of premises was contributed by such emotions. For we would not be epistemically justified in believing the conclusion of an inference whose premises were merely entertained in thought, unasserted, right? Because unasserted thoughts can't be epistemically justified. Those kinds of premises couldn't provide justification for believing the conclusion. A further category of views of emotions holds that they're perceptions, or are closely analogous to perceptions. Since perceptual states are not had for reasons and are not reasons accessible, views of the emotions as perceptual states will not be in a position to recognize the possibility of emotions contributing to the justification of the conclusion by being themselves epistemically justified. And, I mean, many people have thought that that's just immediately a disadvantage of those views, that it doesn't recognize what we intuitively take to be the case with emotions, that they are reasons accessible and can be justified. So indignation or anger or pride can be justified or it can be unjustified. Perceptual views of emotion need instead to insist that in any legitimate cases of emotional persuasion, the emotion involved contribute to justifying the adoption of the conclusion by being themselves sources of epistemic justification, just as perceptual states might plausibly be understood as sources of justification for beliefs that things are the way perception presents them as being, i.e., they're evidence that things are thus and so. In principle, I think that view might be fine. In practice, I think there are difficulties. Of course, there are widely canvassed doubts about whether emotions can be perceptual states in this way in the first place. But beyond those general doubts, Michael Brady has recently drawn attention to problems in the way the perceptual model conceives of the epistemic role of emotions. So I'm going to reprise one of his arguments and add one of my own. Brady points out that the perceptual model implies that emotions are evidentially valuable in cases where this isn't plausible. Or not just implies, I mean it's kind of central to the position. So in the perceptual case, so as in the case of perception, talking about perceptions rather than emotions, in the perceptual case, suppose a reliable colleague tells me that it's raining and everything's getting soaked outside. Okay, so I've heard this from a reliable colleague. Then I step outside and I perceive that it's raining and everything's getting soaked, possibly including myself. I'm one of the things getting soaked. So, of course, although in important respects my perceptual experience tells me some things that I already knew, it strengthens my evidential position, right? I'm better off evidentially when I've gone outside and seen and felt that it's raining and everything's getting soaked, even though that, in a sense, wasn't news to me because I'd heard it from a reliable colleague. But I've got stronger epistemic justification than I had before for my conviction that it's raining. Now, the perceptual view of emotions suggests that it should be like this in the emotional case, but it isn't. Brady's example is that the sharp horns and rapid advance of the bull in the same field as me give me good reason to believe it's dangerous. On the perceptual view of emotions, fear is a perceptual experience of the object's dangerousness, of the bull's dangerousness, and has evidential value accordingly. So my fear itself should give me extra evidence, perceptual evidence, above and beyond what I have in the bull's sharp horns and rapid advance, for believing that the bull is dangerous. So if you like, the thought is I can emotionally see that the bull's dangerous in the way that I could then, when I stepped outside, I could see, as well as kind of knowing by other means, I got the evidence of my senses as well that it was raining. Okay, but that just doesn't seem a plausible thing to say in the bull case. And in the sojourner truth case, if we ask what reasons we would have for believing that women are being treated unjustly, the perceptual theory says implausibly that in addition to the facts of women contributing equally and being treated worse, the listener's indignation at this injustice itself counts as extra evidence, i.e. above and beyond women's contributing equally and being treated worse, that women are being treated unjustly. If you like, the emotion itself sort of adds extra evidence. That's what we should expect if the theory were right. If that were putting us, if you like, perceptually in touch with the injustice. So I concur with Brady that this suggests that emotions don't serve as sources of epistemic value in that way, i.e. as evidence in the way that perceptions do. Now, a further difficulty relates to the model of emotional persuasion that we're considering. So the caliber of justification, the observation here is that justification is gradable. You can have more or less of it. And the caliber of justification that an audience has as a result of emotional persuasive arguments can vary. And one way this happens is that the level of epistemic justification conferred on the conclusion by the emotional premises varies. And the most natural way to explain this is by variation in how justified those emotions themselves are. So, for example, how justified the audience, Sojourner Truth's audience, indignation is. How justified is that affects how much justification that subsequently transmits down to the conclusion. But the perceptual model, right, you can't say that on the perceptual model, right, because perceptions aren't candidates for justification. Perceptual theories can, of course, rate some perceptions as evidentially more valuable than others. So in just the way that what I see through the fog or at night time or with my glasses off has less evidential value than what I see with my glasses on in broad daylight on a clear day. Some conditions are better for perception than others. Could there be some account of better conditions for emotional perceptions that could explain why some emotional arguments provide better epistemic justification and hence persuade more legitimately than others? So if you consider again premise 3 that I've been referring to, the indignation, the premise that could be kind of constituted by a state of indignation. what would be favourable conditions for a more accurate emotional perception of the injustice done to women? In the perceptual case, favourable conditions are conditions that favour the accuracy of the perceptual representation. In the emotional case, of course, it's not literally the case that, for example, Sojourner Truth's listeners are in perceptual contact with the injustice itself. The accuracy of their feelings of indignation at this injustice surely depends on the quality of evidence and reasons on which their indignation rests, i.e., on the evidential support for women's contributing equally and being treated worse. But if that's what the level of justification contributed by emotions depends on, then the epistemic contribution of the audience's indignation to the persuasive argument stems not from their having the evidential character of perceptual experiences as sources of epistemic justification, but from those emotions being themselves epistemically justified by other reasons and evidence, i.e. reasons for evidence of equal contribution or unequal treatment. So, and obviously it's that kind of evidence that Sojourner Truth partly provides and can partly just take for granted as just known by her audience. In other words, accounting for the variation in how much justification is contributed by emotions drives us, seems to me, away from the perceptual model and back towards views on which emotions are themselves candidates for justification. So when we look at a premise like premise 3 in Sojourner Truth's argument and ask, what would determine how well or poor, how much epistemic justification is contributed by, say, that premise, we answer that by saying, well, what is the sense of what is the sense of indignation based on? I.e., what is the on what basis is there this conviction that there's an admirable contribution and an inferior treatment? Right? If that's based on flimsy evidence, then it looks as though the amount of justification that that premise can contribute to the conclusion is less. If that's based on very strong evidence, then it looks as though it contributes more. I mean, that seems to be the most natural thing to say about what would make the drawing of the conclusion based on that premise more as opposed to less justified. I'm open to suggestions on this, but I can't myself see a plausible alternative to this available within the perceptual model. And if this is right, it's already a significant result. There must be at least some emotions that can be epistemically justified in something like the way in which beliefs can be. And it can be important in at least some context, for example, where emotions are being used persuasively, to assess emotions for their epistemic justification. Now, of course, this doesn't show that emotions must literally involve beliefs or judgments, but it does seem to underscore the credentials of those theories of emotion that recognize belief-like elements in at least some emotions. So we're seeking to understand how emotional persuasion, such as that used by Sojourner Truth, could be legitimate, where this is understood in the kind of way suggested by propriety at the outset of the talk. Following Aristotle's plausible proposal, we're thinking of emotional persuasion as using inferences in which the audience's emotions play the same role as their beliefs might have done, as the way in which one or more premises of the inference are supplied. We highlighted 3 conditions for this to result in the audiences being justified in believing the conclusion. The first was that the audience performed the inference. This presents no special obstacle for emotional persuasion. The second was that the premises contribute justification to the conclusion, and it turns out that this was rather difficult to accommodate on some theories of emotion and requires that emotions exhibit the somewhat belief-like feature of being candidates for epistemic justification. And I think the third condition takes us in a similar direction. The third condition is simple and applies in cases where the premises are not supplied perceptually. And it's this: you can't be epistemically justified in believing a conclusion on the basis of an inference that depends on premises that you merely entertain in thought without, if you like, mentally asserting them. What I'm getting at here is without being committed to their being true or at least likely. But this is very significant for emotional persuasion, for if emotions are the mental state in the listener providing premises for an inference that they perform and whose conclusion they're being supposed to be justified in believing on the basis of the inference, those emotions had better involve the subject's commitment to the truth or likelihood of the content that constitutes the premise. In Sojourner Truth's argument, if the audience is supposed to be justified in believing 6 and 7 on the basis of this argument, that it would be unjust to oppose women's rights and that they should not oppose it, they had better not leave crucial premises such as 3 unasserted and merely entertained in thought. However, on some views of what emotions are, they might involve no commitment to the truth of the way they represent things as being, i.e. they involve nothing like assertion. And this is true of views in which the emotions involve or are based on what Tamar Gendler has called alifs, or on thought theories of emotion, which are actually usually pluralist about what kind of cognitive attitude is involved in emotion. This condition, this third condition, requires that those emotions that contribute to persuasion in the way described, if it's to be legitimate, this condition requires that those must involve a cognitive attitude of commitment to the truth or likelihood of the emotion's representational contents. And to that extent, the emotions must be belief-like. Of course, it doesn't follow from this that emotions literally involve beliefs. Indeed, it's often been supposed that their representational aspect cannot literally consist of beliefs because of the kinds of ways in which beliefs and emotions can conflict. That actually seems right to me. They can't. But discussion of that issue can't be pursued here. One of the goals of the paper is to draw attention to the fact that the legitimate persuasive use of emotion has important bearing on this issue of exactly how we should characterize the cognitions involved in the emotions. If the legitimate persuasive use of emotions is to be vindicated, as I suggest it should be, and if it's to be understood as operating through the emotions supplying premises to arguments that confer epistemic justification on the adoption of their conclusion, then this seems to suggest that emotions have two belief-like features. These are that they are themselves candidates for epistemic justification and that they involve commitment to the truth or likelihood of their represented content. This doesn't amount to the claim that emotions are literally in whole or part beliefs, and probably that, it's just to kind of emphasize what I'm not concluding from this. But I think the if you like, the leverage on our views of emotion exerted by looking at their role in legitimate persuasion is no less significant for that. So these features arguably can be accommodated not just, of course, by judgmentalist views of emotion, but by sui generis views such as Goldie's, by pluralist views of the cognitive attitudes involved in emotions, such as are held by most thought theorists, and no doubt by others besides. But they can't be accommodated by all views of the emotions. And if the account that I've presented of emotional persuasion is correct, then that counts against those views. So, to conclude, I've sought to draw attention to the phenomenon of the persuasive use of emotional arousal. Instances can be found in a whole variety of different cultural contexts across global history, but I focused on Sojourner Truth's emotional argument from 1851 in favour of women's rights as a representative example. In such cases, I've proposed that emotional arousal deserves to be recognised as playing an integral role in how a person comes to change their mind, and that this kind of use of emotional arousal is a legitimate persuasive method, and I call that claim anti-austerity. I've sought to show that this is consistent with a view which I call propriety, that people should be persuaded only on grounds that contribute to justifying their inclination to favour what the speaker proposes. And I've briefly defended Aristotle's view that the best account of how emotion arousal produces persuasion legitimately is that the emotions supply premises to inferences that the audience is then encouraged to make and whose conclusion they are encouraged to believe. If this view is correct, it has interesting implications for the nature of the emotions involved. Although they need not, and perhaps must not, literally involve beliefs, it turns out that the representational aspect of emotions involved in legitimate emotion arousal must have two belief-like features. It must be capable of being epistemically justified and must involve commitment to the truth or likelihood of its represented content. As such, the phenomenon of the persuasive use of emotion arousal has substantive, interesting, and challenging implications for our wider views of the emotions.